Hello, Paul Ewerter with Medscape Infectious Diseases. And many of us were happy to be back meeting in person at IDWeek in Washington in mid-October, which was the first time in 3 years. There were many excellent presentations, but I thought I would just focus on a few of the late breaker COVID presentations that would be interesting for you to know about in terms of either incorporating your practice or perhaps some interesting presentations in front of the FDA soon. The first drug I'd like to mention is sabizabulin. This is a colchicine-like molecule that's a microtubular disruptor, but it works a bit differently by targeting two different sites on microtubules. And it's thought to have both antiviral and anti-inflammatory properties. This drug was reported in an interim way this past July in the New England Journal when 204 patients who had severe COVID-19 were randomized to standard of care or this drug, which was given up to 21 days. What was found there was a rather significant 24.9% absolute reduction or 55% relative reduction in mortality that was followed up to 60 days. Now, what was somewhat unusual in this multi-center trial that did include patients from the United States and Brazil was a high mortality rate of 45% in the placebo group. And this was done earlier in the pandemic, but in the Delta and early Omicron phases. Now, what was additionally added in the late breaker session was a subset analysis of this group that looked at patients only on low flow or supplemental oxygen, but who were also had risk factors for hospitalization. This only numbered 88 patients, so much smaller, who fell into that WHO ordinal scale of 4. Now, they found that the mortality rate there dropped from 27.6% amongst placebo to 5.2%. Again, a significant reduction, although the high mortality amongst placebo, even this low sort of mild to moderate group of COVID, is a bit surprising. Uh, Also, this drug did correlate with reduced hospital length of stay, falling from 24 to 13 days, ICU care for those that required it, 17 to 4, and ventilator days from 17 to 3. Uh, now, whether in this current Omicron era the drug's effect on mortality would be as large, I think is probably not the case since there is a much lower mortality rate. People are more immunized or have had infection, granting immunity. But this is a well tolerated drug, and this will be presented in November in front of the Food and Drug Administration. There were two other trials I thought I would report on briefly for you. The Active 6 trial was a multi-arm trial that looked at repurposed drugs, including ivermectin, fluticasone inhaler, and fluvoxamine, which was compared to placebo during the Delta and early Omicron waves. The primary endpoint was resolution of symptoms for 3 days. And this study was unique as it looked at these repurposed drugs, but was conducted by telemedicine visits with direct mailing to the participants. So there might be a somewhat of a lag in terms of starting the medications as opposed to people running out that day to the store. Regardless, this was a generally younger group than some of the other studies, even in outpatient COVID-19, and there were few hospitalizations, therefore. Ultimately, there were no differences in outcomes in terms of resolution of symptoms for 3 days. The drugs were generally without significant adverse effects, although there was one death in the ivermectin arm. And I also noticed that the uh, ivermectin data arm was published in JAMA this past week, and that reference is included below. Uh, what this means is yet another nail in the coffin, I think, for repurposed drugs. And was also interesting, I thought, about the way this trial was conducted entirely remotely and by mailing drugs to patients. The last study I'll briefly mention was presented as a late breaker, the Active 1M study that looked at whether two anti-inflammatory agents might enhance uh, recovery. And the drugs that were examined were infliximab and abatacept. And uh, abatacept is a drug FDA approved for rheumatoid arthritis, and it works a bit differently as a selective T cell co-stimulatory modifier. And of course, many of you are aware of infliximab, which has been around for a while as a TNF inhibitor. The primary endpoint was time to recovery. And in this case, both arms were not significant, but on secondary analysis had reduced 28-day and 60-day mortality for infliximab, and for the abatacept, this particular drug also had reduced 28-day mortality, but did not reach the primary endpoint of reducing time to recovery, but was just barely off statistical significance with a p-value of 0.057. Now, there been perhaps some consideration where these drugs might fit in the same way as the better studied baricitinib and tocilizumab. Certainly, these are intriguing, but at this late stage, I don't think there's much added, although we have faced occasional drug shortages. And of course, some of these newer variants that are emerging, we do worry whether we may be in circumstances such as during the early Omicron or Delta waves when we saw greater severity of illness. So, this, of course, remains unknown. But I think it's helpful to just be aware of information and potential alternatives in this regard. Thanks so much for listening.